The night opens like an old book, its pages edged with dust and quiet light. Tonight we travel through time, not to chase glory or war, but to listen. Beneath centuries of silence, the world still whispers. Its stories wait, patient and unhurried, breathing softly beneath the stars. The world you are about to enter is both familiar and distant, a landscape built of memory, stone, and echo. It begins in stillness, where torches flicker against the cold and footsteps fade into wet earth. This is not a history of kings or empires. It is the story of how people lived when the night was long and the sky felt close. Imagine the first breath of dawn touching the walls of a forgotten village. The fields are damp, the roofs heavy with dew. Smoke rises from the hearths of cottages, thin and slow, curling into the pale light. Somewhere, a bell rings, calling to work, to prayer, to the rhythm that shaped entire lives. For those who lived then, time moved not in minutes, but in seasons. In the turning of soil, in the growing and dying of grain, in the brief warmth between one winter and the next. In this slow world, everything carried meaning. The color of a flame, the pattern of frost, the sound of wind through the thatch. All were signs, messages written in nature's quiet language. People did not look for mystery in the distant heavens. They found it in their own breath, in the weight of silence before a storm, in the warmth that lingered after a fire had gone out. To survive was to listen. Beneath this calm, stories unfolded, some strange, some tender, all human. There were warriors who entered battle with minds emptied by trance, their fury a kind of stillness. There were towns where people danced themselves into exhaustion, searching for release when words failed. There were children who walked toward horizons that never opened, believing innocence could change the world. There were trials held not in courts but in courtyards, where pigs and beetles stood before judges, and justice reached even the smallest of lives. Each story, however strange, carried a truth that order and chaos were always intertwined, and that meaning was found not in certainty but in endurance. The world of the Middle Ages was not the darkness history often claims. It was a world of patience, of builders raising abbeys from mud, of monks writing by candlelight while the wind shook the walls, of knights who spoke less of conquest than of silence. It was a world where every act, no matter how small, was bound to something larger, to ritual, to faith, to the long rhythm of survival. Even myths, in their quiet way, were guides. The outlaw in green who stole not for greed, but for fairness. The knight in black who rode through shadow, loyal to doubt as much as to duty. The woman who wore the mask of power, hidden and enduring in history's folds. Their stories were not written to amaze, they were meant to remember. To remind those who listened that courage can be quiet, and that strength often hides beneath restraint. As you walk through this world, do not hurry. Let the past move at its own pace. The torches will burn low, the wind will shift, the centuries will breathe. You will pass through halls of stone and over bridges of mist. You will hear the hum of forgotten prayers, the soft rhythm of tools against earth, the laughter of people who have long since become dust, and beneath it all, you will sense the same truth that has always lingered, that history is not a distant thing, but a long, slow exhale that never truly ends. So, settle in, dim the lights, let the noise of the present drift away. The stories are waiting, not to be understood, but to be felt. Listen to the pulse beneath them, the quiet heartbeat of civilizations that once moved, breathed, and dreamed just as we do now. The night is long but gentle. and within its calm, the past begins to stir. The quiet beginning. The night opens slowly, the way a long closed book breathes when its cover is first lifted. The air moves with a faint sound, part wind, part memory. It slips through cracks in stone, slides along wooden beams darkened by centuries of smoke, and settles in corners where dust has learned the shape of time. Somewhere far away, a bell tolls once, its note low and steady, folding itself into the darkness. The sound does not disturb the quiet, it completes it. You stand at the edge of a narrow street paved with uneven stones. The world feels smaller here, contained within walls that lean toward one another, as though the houses themselves are whispering secrets across the empty space between them. Above, the moon drifts behind a thin veil of cloud, its light soft enough to blur every outline. Torches burn along the walls, their flames rising and falling in rhythm with the faint breath of the night. Shadows stretch and curl, never still, always reaching. This is not a city awake. It is a city resting, a city between hours, waiting for the dawn that will bring life back to its corridors. Yet within the silence, the past is awake. It stirs beneath the cobblestones, within the cracks of the doors, inside the hearts of the stones themselves. Every wall carries a memory. Every beam remembers the warmth of hands that shaped it. Every alley holds the echo of a name once called, a song once sung, a promise once made. History does not shout here. It hums. It moves like a current beneath water, unseen but constant. If you listen long enough, you can almost hear it, the soft clatter of wooden carts over wet stone, the murmur of merchants haggling by candlelight, the sigh of wind against cloth hanging to dry. Somewhere, a dog stirs and returns to sleep. Somewhere, a window creaks open and a face appears for a moment, curious, half hidden, then vanishes again. The medieval world was made of rhythm, the rhythm of bells that marked each hour, the rhythm of seasons that ruled the land, the rhythm of prayer and work, hunger and harvest. It was a world of order and imagination, of boundaries drawn not only on maps but in minds. Yet within those boundaries lived a strange freedom, the freedom of wonder. The people of that age walked beneath skies without smoke, under stars so sharp they seemed close enough to touch. They read meaning in their patterns, direction in their turning, and comfort in their repetition. Life was not simple, but it was steady. Morning began with the scent of bread and ash. Midday carried the noise of hammers, of wheels turning, of distant bells calling workers to rest. Evening was for stories told by firelight, tales of heroes and saints, of beasts that roamed the forests, of oceans that swallowed men whole. And then night returned, the same night that stands before you now, endless and still, holding the world in its cool, forgiving hand. If you close your eyes, you can feel how the air itself has weight, a mixture of smoke, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of hay. It carries the traces of all who have walked here before. Soldiers and scholars, masons and mothers, children who laughed in the rain. They have long since vanished, yet something of them remains, woven into the quiet fabric of this place. The stones remember every step, the walls remember every word. You move slowly past doors bound with iron and windows covered by wooden shutters. The torchlight flickers across carvings, faces, crosses, small patterns that once meant protection. The craft of the past was patient. Each mark was made to last, each line drawn with care, because time itself was the artist's companion. No one hurried. The world was large, and days were long. Beyond the houses lies the open square. Its fountain has gone dry, but the bowl of stone still shines faintly under the moon. You can almost hear the ghost of water falling, the quiet rhythm of buckets dipping, of hands washing, of whispers shared between strangers. The ground beneath your feet is worn smooth, not by centuries of storm, but by the slow passing of lives. In this stillness, history feels alive. It does not stand behind glass or rest in books. It breathes beside you, calm and patient. The night carries its voice, low and even, telling you that nothing ever truly ends. That every story, no matter how faint, leaves an echo. The myths of this time are not warnings or lessons. They are memories shaped into stories so that the world might keep them safe. They speak of knights who rode into fog and never returned, of towers built to watch the sea, of songs sung in languages now lost. They belong to an age that balanced fear with faith, hunger with hope, violence with silence. For every sword raised, there was a candle lit. For every wall built, a window opened to the sky. The people of this age did not think of history as we do. To them, time was not a line, but a circle. Each harvest followed the last. Each generation lived within the traces of those before. The same soil that fed the living held the dead, and from that balance came peace. When they looked at the stars, they did not see distance. They saw pattern. They saw continuity. Somewhere beyond the town walls, the fields lie sleeping under the weight of mist. The crops rustle softly, moved by a breeze that smells of rain and cold iron. Farther still, forests rise, dark and ancient, filled with the slow breathing of trees. The world is vast, yet it feels contained, like a thought that never ends. In moments like this, the border between centuries fades. The night you walk through could belong to any age. The torchlight, the stones, the silence. They have all existed before, and they will exist again. Time repeats itself, not through events, but through sensations. The warmth of a fire, the sound of rain against wood, the feeling of being both alone and connected to everything. You breathe in. The air tastes of age and calm. You breathe out, and the quiet accepts you. The pulse of the world slows, the sound of footsteps fades. The stories gather like mist around your mind, soft, weightless, endless. In this calm, the medieval world unfolds not as a stage of cruelty or glory, but as a dream still in motion, a dream made of human breath, of effort, of the gentle will to survive. The laws that seem strange today were once threads holding the fabric of life together. The customs that now seem distant once brought comfort in the face of uncertainty. Even fear then had its purpose. It reminded people that they were alive, that the night was vast, and that somewhere beyond it, morning would always come. Now the torches burn lower. The air grows heavier. The hum of the world softens until it becomes silence again. You stand at the edge of memory, where the stories of the past drift towards sleep. They will not vanish, they will rest. And as they rest, so do you. The night closes its eyes. The stones exhale. The quiet beginning continues, unbroken, eternal, waiting for the next breath of history to rise once more. The silent rage of the north. Far in the northern lands, beneath skies that never truly brighten and never truly fade, the air carries a stillness shaped by snow and salt. The sea moves with the sound of deep breath, slow, rhythmic, unending, and the wind drifts over mountains rimmed with ice. Here, winter is not a season, it is a state of being. The earth lies half asleep, its rivers sealed under glass, its forests whispering only when the wind passes through their bare bones. Among these frozen fields, long before maps drew their borders, people gathered to prepare for war. They were called Vikings, farmers, traders, sailors, raiders, and among them lived a few whose names would blur into legend. They were the berserkers. In the sagas, their presence feels unreal, a storm wrapped in skin, a moment where man and fury become one. Before battle, they stood apart, wrapped in the pelts of bears or wolves, their bodies bare beneath the fur, their breath steaming in the morning cold. Around them, the warriors murmured low, half in awe, half in fear, for these were men who no longer seemed bound to the same world. The rituals began quietly. A fire was lit, its smoke rising pale against the frost. Someone beat a drum carved from the hide of an animal hunted in the previous season. The rhythm was slow at first, heartbeats counted against the wind. Then voices joined, not singing but humming, the sound vibrating in the chest rather than the ear. The berserker breathed deeper, eyes fixed on nothing. They had fasted for days. They had stood awake through nights so cold that breath froze on the lips. Their minds, hollowed of comfort, began to fill with something else, an immense, detached calm. Later generations would find traces of mushrooms dried and stored in small pouches among Viking graves. Amanita muscaria, the red-capped fungus with white speckles that grows under birch and pine, carries within it a slow, shifting poison that bends the body's senses inward. Eaten raw, it can bring nausea and confusion. Prepared with care, dried beside the fire until its bitterness fades, it can open the world like a door slightly unlatched. The body grows light, pain drifts away, time unravels into single moments stretched long and thin. To the one who has consumed it, fear loses its edge. Exhaustion becomes a pulse rather than a wall. When combined with hunger, chanting, and the beating of drums, the border between body and world begins to dissolve. In this place beyond ordinary thought, the berserker waited. His heartbeat matched the drum, his breath became smoke, and the smoke became cloud. When the signal came, the low horn echoing across the fjord, he moved, not with rage, but with the precision of something guided by instinct alone. His body no longer felt cold. His wounds, if they came, felt distant, like touches through water. He was not invincible, he was unreachable. The others followed in his wake, drawn by that strange certainty, that surrender to motion. What appeared from afar as madness was, inside the moment, a kind of deep stillness. They fought not for cruelty, but for rhythm. Every strike, every shout, was part of the same long exhale. The battlefield was not chaos, it was a vast and terrible calm. When the fighting ended and the smoke lifted, the berserker often fell into silence. Some sat for hours, unmoving, eyes vacant, as if returning from a place language could not reach. Others wept without reason. To live at that edge, to step so far from one's own mind, left a mark deeper than any wound. Stories of these men traveled faster than ships. They reached the coasts of Britain, the rivers of Francia, the forests of roots. To face a berserker was to face something not entirely human. Villages told tales of warriors who could not die, who laughed as blades cut them, who tore through shields as if through cloth. The truth, as always, was quieter. They could die, and often did. They were mortal men who found a way to make fear itself disappear for a while, and in that vanishing they became both legend and warning. When the raids ended and peace returned, the berserkers were not easily folded back into the rhythm of daily life. Some became wanderers, some guarded kings, their fury turned into discipline. Others withdrew to the wilderness, choosing solitude over the slow unease of villages. The sagas tell of men who could not sleep, who woke screaming at sounds only they could hear. In dreams, the drums never stopped. The trance that had once freed them from fear returned in echoes that would not fade. Winter after winter, their stories hardened into myth. Poets sang of them by firelight, their verses softened by centuries of retelling. The berserker became not a man, but a symbol, the embodiment of strength without mercy, of courage without thought. Yet hidden beneath the tales is a quieter truth, that what made them powerful also made them fragile. To silence fear completely is to silence part of what keeps a person whole. Their rage was not noise but absence, a hollow space where feeling once lived. The northern lands remember them still. In museums, small carvings show men with wild eyes and open mouths, caught between roar and breath. In sagas written on parchment darkened by smoke, their names are etched beside kings and gods. But outside the words, in the long hush of modern snow, nothing remains of their fury. Only the same wind, the same sea, the same long night that shaped their world. If you listen now, you can almost hear the old rhythm return, the drum beneath the waves, the heartbeat inside the earth. The rage that once burned has cooled into memory, and memory into song. The northern lights drift above, moving slowly, soundless ribbons of green and pale blue. They stretch across the sky like the breath of forgotten gods, their shimmer tracing the same paths the long ships once followed. Where those ships have vanished, only the water keeps their reflection. To stand on that shore is to feel time fold inward. The same cold that touched the berserker's skin brushes yours. The same scent of pine and salt fills the air. You can sense the weight of 1,000 winters pressing down, steady but kind. The earth hums in its deep voice, older than war, older than anger. In that sound lies understanding, the knowledge that strength is not in the shout, but in the silence that follows it. As dawn rises over the fjord, the world brightens without warmth. The warriors are gone, their camps are buried beneath moss, their bones scattered among roots. Yet the legend lingers like breath upon glass. The berserker's fury was not a curse, but a form of surrender to cold, to rhythm, to the vastness of being alive in a land where survival required becoming part of the storm. To face such a warrior was to see what happens when fear dissolves completely, when the body becomes the wind and the soul forgets its boundaries. And now, centuries later, as the snow falls softly over silent hills, that memory rests in the air. The fury has quieted, but the calm remains. The north still holds its breath. The world still waits for the next heartbeat, slow and sure, beneath the endless silver sky. The summer of endless dance. The summer of 1518 settled over Strasbourg like a slow fever. The air was thick with dust and the scent of grain. The sun pressed down on the rooftops until even the shadows felt warm. Markets were quiet, fields had yielded little, hunger had begun to move through the town as quietly as smoke. People worked and waited, their thoughts heavy with the weight of heat. Then one morning, in a narrow street lined with timbered houses, a woman began to dance. Her name has faded through time, remembered only as Frau Trophäa. She stepped into the open road and began to move, slowly at first, her feet touching the stones with awkward rhythm. There was no laughter in it, no festival, no music. Her face held no joy. It was as if her body had been taken by something that would not let go. She turned, swayed, stumbled, and rose again. Neighbors watched from doorways, uncertain whether to help or to stay back. The sound of her feet striking stone echoed through the narrow street like a heartbeat. Hours passed. She did not stop. By nightfall, she was still there, hair clinging to her skin, her breath shallow but steady. When dawn came, she danced again. The townspeople whispered that it must be madness or sickness or sin, but no one dared to restrain her. They said she would dance herself out of it. She did not. Within days, others joined her, first one, then three, then a dozen. They moved together, uncoordinated but bound by the same invisible rhythm. Some wept as they danced, some laughed with hollow joy. Most simply moved, unable to explain why. The sound filled the streets, the slap of feet, the rasp of breath, the faint murmur of bodies in motion. Mothers left their work. Merchants dropped their scales, even priests and healers stood in silence, watching as the movement spread. By the second week, there were more than 100. They filled the square before the church, their bodies turning like reeds in a current. Some collapsed, carried aside to rest, only to rise again and return to the crowd. They danced through heat and hunger, through exhaustion and pain. The skin of their feet broke open, still they moved. Some said they saw visions, rivers of light, faces in the air, the sky bending above them like glass. Some heard music where there was none. Others claimed they heard nothing at all, only the steady pulse inside their own skulls. The town's leaders grew desperate. Physicians were summoned. They called it a sickness of the blood, a fever of the mind. They suggested it must be cured through motion. Let the body dance the illness away. So musicians were brought into the square, hired to play fiddles and drums, to match rhythm with rhythm. For a time, the city became an open stage, but the music did not heal. It deepened the trance. The dancers moved faster, as if sound itself pulled them forward. And when the players stopped, the silence was unbearable. So they played again. Each night, the fires burned low along the river. The town slept uneasily, hearing the faint thud of feet continuing in the dark. Somewhere in that constant motion was a kind of release. People who had lost everything, harvests, families, faith, found a space where pain became movement, and movement became forgetfulness. For a moment, the weight of the world lifted. Then it pressed down again, heavier than before. Modern voices would later offer explanations. They would speak of ergot, the fungus that grows on damp rye, releasing poisons that can twist vision and sense. They would suggest famine and fear had conspired to break the mind, that starvation had turned the body into a vessel for panic. Perhaps they were right, or perhaps the dance was something simpler. The body's rebellion against despair, a human need to move when words and tears were no longer enough. The chronicles tell that the city council ordered the construction of a wooden platform to contain the dancers, a place where they might move safely away from the crowds. They did, for a while. The air above the platform shimmered with heat. The sound of feet striking boards filled the days. Children watched from doorways, afraid to come closer. The dancers' faces were pale, lips cracked, eyes distant, fixed on something beyond the horizon. Even the wind seemed to move in time with them. Week after week, the dance continued. Healers brought water and bread. Some dancers refused to eat, shaking their heads as though the rhythm itself was enough. A few collapsed and did not rise again. Their bodies were carried away quietly, and the dance went on. It was not joy, nor celebration, nor madness alone. It was a kind of surrender, the point where exhaustion becomes peace, where the will releases its hold. By the fourth week, the city began to empty. Farmers stayed in their fields, merchants left their stalls. Even the council grew silent. The musicians stopped playing, the heat broke, rain fell, washing the dust from the streets. The dancers slowed. One by one, they stopped. Some fell to the ground, trembling. Some lay still and slept for days. Others simply walked away, leaving behind no words, no memory, of what had moved them. When it ended, the silence was immense. The square that had pulsed with bodies stood empty, save for faint marks of feet in the mud. The sound of normal life returned slowly, the creak of carts, the calls of traders, the quiet ringing of the church bell. But the air still held something different, something unseen. It was as if the city itself was catching its breath after a long dream. No one truly understood what had happened. The physicians wrote reports, the priests prayed. The town's records listed it simply as the dancing plague. Then, like all things that cannot be explained, it faded into story. In time, it became legend, a tale told beside fires, softened by years until its strangeness turned to mystery. The people of Strasbourg continued their lives. The fields were planted again. The river carried away the memory of those endless days. But beneath the surface of history, the rhythm remained, faint but steady, waiting in the deep part of human memory where sorrow and movement meet. Centuries later, when the world grew quiet again, under its own weight, scholars would read the old accounts and wonder at the details, the heat, the hunger, the visions, the music. They would measure it, analyze it, translate it into reason. Yet reason could not capture what truly lingered there, the shared pulse of human endurance, the way despair can turn into motion, and motion into calm. Imagine now that square at dusk, the light dimming against the timbered walls. The air carries the scent of rain and rye. A few dancers remain, moving slowly, their shadows long against the cobblestones. The sound of their feet is almost gentle now, a whisper against stone. The day fades. The torches burn low. The rhythm softens until it is no longer a rhythm at all, just the echo of what once was. The town exhales, the people return to their homes, doors close, windows shutter. The night takes the square back into its keeping. The dance, which had begun without reason and ended without purpose, leaves behind only quiet. And in that quiet lies something strangely human, the need to move, to release, to forget, even for a moment, the long weight of being alive. Now the streets are empty. The stars hang low above the Rhine. The same wind that carried the dust of that summer still moves through the city's corners, brushing across stone and timber, whispering softly to no one in particular. It carries no music, no fever, no madness, only memory, folded neatly into the rhythm of time. The world has stilled again, as it always does. And somewhere, in the deep silence that follows, if you listen carefully, you might still hear the faint rhythmic echo of bare feet moving without sound through the endless summer of long ago. The summer of endless dance. The summer of 1518 settled over Strasbourg like a slow fever. The air was thick with dust and the scent of grain. The sun pressed down on the rooftops until even the shadows felt warm. Markets were quiet, fields had yielded little, hunger had begun to move through the town as quietly as smoke. People worked and waited, their thoughts heavy with the weight of heat. Then one morning, in a narrow street lined with timbered houses, a woman began to dance. Her name has faded through time, remembered only as Frau Trophäa. She stepped into the open road and began to move, slowly at first, her feet touching the stones with awkward rhythm. There was no laughter in it, no festival, no music. Her face held no joy. It was as if her body had been taken by something that would not let go. She turned, swayed, stumbled, and rose again. Neighbors watched from doorways, uncertain whether to help or to stay back. The sound of her feet striking stone echoed through the narrow street like a heartbeat. Hours passed. She did not stop. By nightfall, she was still there, hair clinging to her skin, her breath shallow but steady. When dawn came, she danced again. The townspeople whispered that it must be madness or sickness or sin. But no one dared to restrain her. They said she would dance herself out of it. She did not. Within days, others joined her, first one, then three, then a dozen. They moved together, uncoordinated but bound by the same invisible rhythm. Some wept as they danced, some laughed with hollow joy, most simply moved, unable to explain why. The sound filled the streets, the slap of feet, the rasp of breath, the faint murmur of bodies in motion. Mothers left their work, merchants dropped their scales, even priests and healers stood in silence, watching as the movement spread. By the second week, there were more than 100. They filled the square before the church, their bodies turning like reeds in a current. Some collapsed, carried aside to rest, only to rise again and return to the crowd. They danced through heat and hunger, through exhaustion and pain. The skin of their feet broke open, still they moved. Some said they saw visions, rivers of light, faces in the air, the sky bending above them like glass. Some heard music, where there was none. Others claimed they heard nothing at all, only the steady pulse inside their own skulls. The town's leaders grew desperate. Physicians were summoned. They called it a sickness of the blood, a fever of the mind. They suggested it must be cured through motion. Let the body dance the illness away. So musicians were brought into the square, hired to play fiddles and drums to match rhythm with rhythm. For a time the city became an open stage, but the music did not heal. It deepened the trance. The dancers moved faster, as if sound itself pulled them forward, and when the players stopped, the silence was unbearable, so they played again. Each night the fires burned low along the river. The town slept uneasily, hearing the faint thud of feet continuing in the dark. Somewhere in that constant motion was a kind of release. People who had lost everything, harvests, families, faith, found a space where pain became movement and movement became forgetfulness. For a moment, the weight of the world lifted. Then it pressed down again, heavier than before. Modern voices would later offer explanations. They would speak of ergot, the fungus that grows on damp rye, releasing poisons that can twist vision and sense. They would suggest famine and fear had conspired to break the mind, that starvation had turned the body into a vessel for panic. Perhaps they were right. Or perhaps the dance was something simpler, the body's rebellion against despair, a human need to move when words and tears were no longer enough. The chronicles tell that the city council ordered the construction of a wooden platform to contain the dancers, a place where they might move safely away from the crowds. They did for a while. The air above the platform shimmered with heat. The sound of feet striking boards filled the days. Children watched from doorways, afraid to come closer. The dancers' faces were pale, lips cracked, eyes distant, fixed on something beyond the horizon. Even the wind seemed to move in time with them. Week after week, the dance continued. Healers brought water and bread. Some dancers refused to eat, shaking their heads as though the rhythm itself was enough. A few collapsed and did not rise again. Their bodies were carried away quietly, and the dance went on. It was not joy, nor celebration, nor madness alone. It was a kind of surrender, the point where exhaustion becomes peace, where the will releases its hold. By the fourth week, the city began to empty. Farmers stayed in their fields, merchants left their stalls. Even the council grew silent. The musicians stopped playing, the heat broke, rain fell, washing the dust from the streets. The dancers slowed, one by one they stopped. Some fell to the ground, trembling. Some lay still and slept for days. Others simply walked away, leaving behind no words, no memory of what had moved them. When it ended, the silence was immense. The square that had pulsed with bodies stood empty, save for faint marks of feet in the mud. The sound of normal life returned slowly, the creak of carts, the calls of traders, the quiet ringing of the church bell. But the air still held something different, something unseen. It was as if the city itself was catching its breath after a long dream. No one truly understood what had happened. The physicians wrote reports, the priests prayed, the town's records listed it simply as the dancing plague. Then, like all things that cannot be explained, it faded into story. In time, it became legend, a tale told beside fires, softened by years until its strangeness turned to mystery. The people of Strasbourg continued their lives. The fields were planted again. The river carried away the memory of those endless days. But beneath the surface of history, the rhythm remained, faint but steady, waiting in the deep part of human memory where sorrow and movement meet. Centuries later, when the world grew quiet again under its own weight, scholars would read the old accounts and wonder at the details, the heat, the hunger, the visions, the music. They would measure it, analyze it, translate it into reason. Yet reason could not capture what truly lingered there, the shared pulse of human endurance, the way despair can turn into motion and motion into calm. Imagine now that square at dusk, the light dimming against the timbered walls. The air carries the scent of rain and rye. A few dancers remain, moving slowly, their shadows long against the cobblestones. The sound of their feet is almost gentle now, a whisper against stone. The day fades. The torches burn low. The rhythm softens until it is no longer a rhythm at all, just the echo of what once was. The town exhales, the people return to their homes, doors close, windows shutter. The night takes the square back into its keeping. The dance, which had begun without reason and ended without purpose, leaves behind only quiet. And in that quiet lies something strangely human. The need to move, to release, to forget, even for a moment, the long weight of being alive. Now the streets are empty, the stars hang low above the Rhine. The same wind that carried the dust of that summer still moves through the city's corners, brushing across stone and timber, whispering softly to no one in particular. It carries no music, no fever, no madness, only memory folded neatly into the rhythm of time. The world has stilled again, as it always does. And somewhere in the deep silence that follows, if you listen carefully, you might still hear the faint rhythmic echo of bare feet moving without sound through the endless summer of long ago. The March of the Innocents. The year was 1212. The spring had come slowly to the valleys of France. The air was soft with rain, the soil dark and ready, and the fields stretched wide beneath skies the colour of unpolished silver. In a small village among the hum of work and the distant tolling of a bell, a boy stood in a meadow and listened to something that no one else could hear. It was said to be a voice, calm, certain, unlike anything that had ever spoken to him before. It told him that he was chosen, that he must lead others toward a holy land, that his youth itself would open the path that warriors could not. His name, like the sound of that voice, would blur with time. Some called him Stephen, the shepherd boy of Cloyes. Some said there was another, Nicholas from the Rhine, who heard the same command. Their stories would merge, their faces would fade, until only the outline of an idea remained. Children, pure and trusting, walking toward the horizon. Word spread slowly at first, carried by travelers and traders, by the soft rumor that something miraculous was beginning. A child leading a crusade without sword or armor, a promise that faith alone could part the sea. And so they came, hundreds of boys and girls, peasants and wanderers, some barely old enough to remember their homes. They brought what they could carry: bread wrapped in cloth, a few coins, a wooden cross tied with string. They sang as they walked, their voices rising like birds over the hills. The road ahead was long and uneven. They followed tracks worn by merchants and pilgrims, paths that wound between fields and forests, over rivers and through towns that stared in wonder as the procession passed. Some gave food, some gave blessings, and some turned away, unable to meet the children's eyes. The travelers' feet blistered, their clothes tore, but still they walked. Each dawn felt like a promise renewed. Each night brought stories whispered beneath the stars of the land they would reach, the sea that would open, the peace that would follow. As the days stretched into weeks, the songs grew quieter. Hunger began to move among them like a slow shadow. Bread ran out. Water turned sour. The youngest stumbled, carried by those stronger. The path through the mountains took their breath. The sun burned their skin, and still they went on. When they reached the sea at last, the wide blue distance at Marseille, they stood upon the shore and waited for a miracle. The water shimmered, vast and calm. They waited one day, then two, then more. Some stepped into the shallows, calling for the waves to part, for the path of light to appear. But the sea did not move. It breathed in and out with its usual rhythm, unmoved by prayers. Slowly, the songs fell silent. The crowd thinned. A few turned back toward home. Others remained, staring at the horizon until the sun fell behind it. What happened next became a matter of legend. Some said that merchants appeared with promises of ships to carry them across. They boarded, believing that the sea had opened in another way, but the ships sailed not to the Holy Land but to the markets of Africa, where the young were sold into bondage. Some said storms rose and the ships were lost, swallowed by the same water they had once believed would deliver them. Others said the children vanished into the hills, their bones buried beneath wildflowers. The truth was never clear. Only fragments remained, letters from bishops, notes in margins, a handful of names written in trembling ink. For those who returned, home was not the same. They had seen too much emptiness to remain children. They spoke little, their eyes older than their years. Villagers listened in silence, unable to understand the distance those children had crossed, not in miles, but in faith. The journey that began in light had ended in stillness, a stillness that stretched across generations. In time, the story became something else. It was called the Children's Crusade, though it was no crusade and brought no victory. It was told by priests, then by poets, then by historians who tried to untangle fact from feeling. Some called it delusion, some called it devotion. Most saw it for what it was, a movement born not of power, but of longing, a longing so strong it mistook hope for direction. The March of the Innocents was not an army, it was a prayer, walking on bare feet. Each step was a word unspoken, each mile a question never answered. The children believed the world could be changed through purity alone, that violence could yield to faith, that suffering could be undone by will. And though their journey ended in silence, something of that belief endured. It lingered like a faint warmth in the cold stone of cathedrals, in the small kindnesses that passed between strangers, in the way people looked toward the horizon and imagined it might still open for them. Centuries later, when chroniclers read the faded records, they found only hints, a papal decree forbidding further marches, a letter from a monk describing the great company of children lost upon the roads. But behind the words, the echo of their footsteps remained. The sound was soft, almost rhythmic, as if the earth itself remembered the weight of those who had trusted it completely. The March of the Innocents is not a story of failure, it is the story of human belief, of hearts that move before understanding. It reminds us that every generation walks towards something it cannot yet see, that faith, whether in God, in hope, or in the simple goodness of the world, is both the beginning and the burden of our journey. The children walked not because they knew the path, but because they believed one existed. In that belief lay both their tragedy and their grace. As night falls once more over the old fields of France, the wind moves softly through the grass. The stars above are the same that watched the march long ago. The villages sleep. The rivers murmur as they once did. Somewhere beyond the hills, the sea still breathes, endless, unchanged. It does not remember the small feet that reached its edge, nor the songs that once rose above its waves. But the earth remembers. The story remains, gentle and unfinished, carried forward not by victory, but by the quiet persistence of hope. And so the march continues, not on roads or through valleys, but within the slow turning of time, where innocence and longing meet and become one. The children are gone, but their journey never ended. It simply folded into the hum of the world, into the long rhythm of humanity searching, always, for the promise of light beyond the horizon. The trials of beasts and men. In the small towns of medieval Europe, justice had its own slow rhythm. It was not the thunder of gavels or the cold formality of later courts. It was closer to ritual, a careful performance of balance between the seen and the unseen. People believed that the world itself had order, that every living thing from king to field mouse belonged to the same invisible law. When that order broke, something had to be done to restore it. And so, on quiet mornings, bells rang to summon both villagers and creatures. In a stone courtyard, smelling of hay and damp soil, a judge took his seat. The crowd gathered. There were farmers and priests, children sitting on walls, dogs shifting restlessly near their masters. In front of them stood the accused, sometimes a pig, sometimes a cow, sometimes a rooster with feathers missing from its neck. The people did not laugh. They watched in silence as the clerk read the charges. The words were formal and steady, spoken as if every syllable might reach the ears of heaven itself. A pig that had killed a child, a bull that had trampled a man in anger, a swarm of caterpillars that had ruined a harvest. To modern eyes, these seem like curiosities, fragments of superstition. But to those who lived then, the world was woven together by purpose. To ignore the act of an animal was to risk inviting chaos. If one creature could harm without answer, what would hold the rest of nature in place? Law then became not merely human, it was cosmic, an attempt to speak order back into being. Lawyers were appointed to defend the beasts. They were real men of learning, versed in Latin and scripture, standing beside their animal clients with grave faces. They argued that the pig had acted in confusion, that the ox had been provoked, that the insects had no moral sense and therefore no guilt. Sometimes they won. A judge might pardon the creature, declaring that it was driven by instinct rather than malice. Other times the verdict was harsh. The animal was declared guilty, its punishment mirroring that of a human criminal. When a pig was condemned, it was dressed in clothes, a tunic, sometimes even a small hat, and paraded through the streets to the place of execution. The townsfolk followed, not to mock, but to witness justice done. The executioner performed his duty as he would for any person. The body was buried outside consecrated ground. It was a grim but solemn affair, carried out with the conviction that fairness must extend to all, even when it seemed absurd. For the smaller offenders, the rats, the beetles, the locusts, the trials were different. These were ecclesiastical cases held inside churches or cloisters. The judge was often a priest. A herald might stand at the altar and announce the summons, "Let all vermin and creeping things who have invaded these fields appear before this court." Of course, none did. Yet the trial continued. Witnesses spoke of the damage done, of fields stripped bare, of hunger spreading. The defense lawyer pleaded that the creatures were God's own, that they acted only according to nature. After deliberation, the priest might pronounce a sentence of excommunication. The insects were ordered to leave the fields within a certain number of days, under threat of divine wrath. Sometimes people said it worked. The pests disappeared soon after, whether by chance or by weather. The villagers saw this as proof that the law reached even the smallest of lives. It gave them comfort, the sense that they were not helpless before the wildness of the world. Justice, even when imagined, had power because it restored calm. Behind these strange customs lay something deeper than superstition. The medieval mind saw creation as a single body. Man, beast, and soil were its organs. If one part suffered or acted wrongly, the whole became sick. A trial then was a kind of healing ritual, a way to speak order back into a body grown restless. It was not cruelty, it was participation in the world's repair. The people of that time did not separate reason from reverence. To them, fairness was a sacred duty, and language itself was the bridge between chaos and peace. The records of these trials survive in fragile ink, Latin scripts copied by monks, notes written in the margins of parchment, lists of names both human and animal. There was the case of the sow executed at Falaise in 1386, the trial of weevils in Saint-Julien in 1545, the prosecution of rats in Autun, where the defense lawyer argued that his clients could not appear because the roads were unsafe for them. The judges listened, weighed the words, and gave their verdicts. The law was satisfied. The world, for a moment, seemed balanced again. What feels strange to us now once felt necessary. These ceremonies held communities together. They taught responsibility even toward the natural world. The people who lived within those stone walls did not believe they ruled nature. They believed they answered to it. By putting a pig on trial, they were acknowledging that harm had been done and must be answered, not by revenge, but by ritual closure. In their courts, fairness was not measured by logic, but by the quiet feeling that every action, every creature, every life deserved its own hearing. Imagine the courtyard after the crowd has gone. The torches are out. The stones still smell faintly of smoke. The judge's bench stands empty, the chair carved from oak, polished by years of use. A few scraps of parchment lie scattered in the dust. Somewhere nearby a dog barks once, then is silent. The night settles back over the town, carrying the faint echo of voices that believed, deeply and without irony, that justice could reach even into the hearts of beasts. Centuries have passed, the courtyards have crumbled, the ink has faded, and reason has replaced ritual. Yet the desire that moved those people remains. We still search for balance between what we can control and what lies beyond us. We still give voice to the voiceless, even if the forms have changed. The medieval trials remind us that fairness is not born from perfection, but from the wish to make meaning where none appears. If you close your eyes now, you can almost hear the murmur of that old crowd, the rustle of clothing, the low hum of prayers. The air is thick with smoke and rain. Somewhere a bell rings once, its note fading into distance. The world feels smaller, but also connected. bound by the same invisible thread that once tied man and creature within the same law. The echo of those trials has long since faded into history, yet their purpose, to find order in a restless world, still hums beneath everything. And as the night deepens, the stones of those forgotten courtyards rest in silence. They no longer carry the weight of judgment, only the faint warmth of memory. Justice, like time, has moved on. But somewhere in the quiet between breath and thought, the world still whispers its ancient promise that all things, great or small, are part of the same long story, and that even the beasts once stood among men to speak their share of truth. The iron that never was. The legend of the Iron Maiden begins not in the age of knights and kings, but centuries later, when the world had already turned its face away from the Middle Ages. By then, the castles had become ruins, and the dungeons were only stories told by firelight. Yet people of the 18th and 19th centuries looked back and imagined the past as darker than it truly was. They built their fears into iron. In museums and traveling exhibitions, a tall, human-shaped coffin appeared. Its doors opened like the wings of a mechanical bird, revealing an interior lined with metal spikes. It was said that a prisoner would be placed inside, the doors closed, and the spikes would pierce the body without killing it outright, holding the victim in silent agony until the end. Visitors stared at the grim shape, half terrified, half fascinated. They whispered that this was the cruelty of the medieval mind, cold, methodical, and unrepentant. But it was a fiction. No record from the Middle Ages speaks of such a device. No chronicler described its use. The Iron Maiden was a product of imagination, not history. The truth is quieter, though no less somber. Medieval prisons were not places of elaborate machines. They were rooms of stone, damp and airless, where punishment came from neglect rather than invention. Chains rusted in the dark. Straw turned sour with time. The air was thick with the scent of metal, mold, and despair. Those who entered did not need spikes to suffer. The slow passing of days was enough. When pain was inflicted, it was usually simple. The stretching of the body upon a rack, the tightening of ropes around limbs, the crushing of fingers between screws. Each act was deliberate, each pause measured, not for spectacle, but for confession. The goal was not death, but submission. The people of that era believed that truth could be drawn out through suffering, that the soul might speak once the body could no longer resist. Cruel by our standards, yet to them it was order, a grim reflection of the belief that every sin required balance. The Iron Maiden, as we know it today, first appeared in Nuremberg in the late 1700s. A local scholar, eager to impress and horrify, combined fragments of older instruments, coffins, spike-lined boxes and legends into a single construction. He displayed it as a relic of medieval punishment. It stood in a chamber lit by oil lamps, its iron glimmering under the wavering light. Visitors gasped, whispered prayers, crossed themselves. They believed they were seeing the face of the past, proof that civilization had progressed. What they were truly seeing was their own reflection. Fear dressed as curiosity. The 19th century loved such myths. As science and industry grew, so did the hunger for the grotesque. The further people moved from superstition, the more they wanted to look back at it. Writers filled their pages with dungeons and torturers, with blood and chains, with queens who watched from behind curtains as confessions were torn from the flesh. The Iron Maiden became their symbol, a cage for both the body and the imagination. Artists painted it, novelists described it, museums built replicas. They called it Die Jungfer von Nürnberg, the Maiden of Nuremberg. Some claimed it was used by inquisitors, others said by kings. None could prove it. Yet proof was unnecessary. The image was enough. The heavy doors, the spikes waiting in silence. It was more haunting than truth could ever be. The myth spread because it suited a need. People wanted to believe they had escaped from something monstrous. To make progress visible, they had to invent the darkness behind them. If you stand before one of these Iron Maidens today, you might notice the strange calm of its surface. The iron is dull, mottled by rust, its spikes uneven and crudely fixed. It feels less like an object of pain and more like a monument to imagination. The eyes carved into the lid seem to watch without judgment. They do not accuse, they remind. What they remind us of is simple, that the stories we tell about cruelty often reveal more about ourselves than about those who came before. In truth, the medieval mind was not obsessed with torture. It was preoccupied with salvation, with structure, with the fragile boundary between sin and order. The acts that seem brutal to us were, to them, attempts to restore cosmic balance. They believed pain could cleanse, that confession could heal the soul, that justice required visible form. The Iron Maiden, had it truly existed, would have been unnecessary. The world already had enough suffering without invention. The myth endures because imagination always fills the spaces history leaves blank. Between what was real and what was feared, a new world grows, one made of shadows and fascination. The Iron Maiden belongs to that shadow world where fact becomes symbol and symbol becomes comfort. It reassures us that cruelty is a thing of the past, that the worst has already been survived. Yet history moves in cycles and each age forges its own iron. In the quiet of a modern museum, you can still hear the soft echo of footsteps as visitors approach the dark figure. Children glance upward, eyes wide. Adults lean closer, whispering explanations that blend disbelief and awe. The Iron Maiden stands silent, absorbing their fear, as it has for centuries. Its hinges do not creak, its spikes do not shine. It remains closed, a mirror for the imagination. Outside the glass case, the world hums with light and motion. The air smells of electricity and dust. Yet for a moment, standing before that iron shell, people feel the same chill that once touched those who first saw it. They are not afraid of what it did, they are afraid of what it represents. The idea that cruelty can be ordinary, that silence can be punishment, that humanity has always been capable of inventing its own darkness. As the lights dim and the museum closes, the Iron Maiden remains in its corner, wrapped in quiet. The night air cools the metal, dust settles on the surface. No screams echo, no ghosts stir. It is only an object, empty, harmless, misunderstood. And yet in its stillness it holds something eternal, the human habit of turning fear into form, of building myths to contain what cannot be faced directly. The Iron Maiden never belonged to the Middle Ages. It belonged to us, to our need for stories that explain the shadows we carry. It is not a relic of cruelty, but of imagination. And in that imagination lies both warning and wonder that even the things that never were can shape the way we see what is. Now the halls are dark. The iron fades into shadow. The air is still, the silence deep. Somewhere beyond the walls, the night moves gently across the earth, carrying with it the same thought that has always lingered, that myths, like memories, are not born to deceive, but to hold our fear softly until morning comes again. The shape of the earth. The world, even in its quietest hours, has never been flat. Those who lived in the Middle Ages knew this not by theory, but by sight. by breath, by the daily rhythm of wind and tide. They watched ships fade slowly over the edge of vision, hull first, then mast, until only the faint glint of a sail remained. They saw shadows move across the face of the moon and traced their perfect curve with calm understanding. To live close to the earth was to see its roundness everywhere, in the turning of the heavens, in the arch of a bridge, in the way day folded seamlessly into night. Long before telescopes, before compasses could whisper north from south, people looked upward and read the sky as a text written in light. The horizon itself was a teacher. Its gentle bend told them that the world was not a table, but a sphere, turning slowly under the steady watch of the stars. In small ports and on open plains, in monasteries filled with books and in fields filled with silence, they understood the shape of the world through patience and repetition. The earth taught them with every sunrise. The myth that they believed otherwise, and that medieval minds thought the world a flat disk floating in darkness, was born much later. It came from centuries that wanted to see themselves as awakened, enlightened, standing above the fog of ignorance. To make progress visible, the past was painted as a shadow, and so the image of flat earth believers entered the story. Sailors trembling at the edge of the sea, priests warning against the abyss, scholars drawing maps of a world that stopped where dragons began. But it was never so. In truth, by the early 13th century, most educated people accepted the Earth's sphericity as a given. The idea traced back to Greece, to Aristotle, who watched lunar eclipses and saw the shadow curve, and to Eratosthenes, who measured that curve with nothing more than a stick, a shadow, and the patience to wait for noon. Medieval scholars did not discard these teachings. They copied them, translated them, taught them again and again in candle-lit halls. To them, the round earth was a symbol of harmony, a reflection of divine order, a sign that creation was both finite and infinite in the same breath. Sailors, of course, did not need philosophy. They learned by experience. The horizon was their compass. They knew that as one ship departed, its form did not shrink evenly, but sank. First its hull, then its mast, until the line between sea and sky swallowed it whole. On their return, the same process reversed. The first sign of home was always the tip of a tower rising from the sea, proof written in distance that the world curved gently beneath their feet. Monks who watched the sky saw the same truth in softer ways. Each night, the stars drifted not in a straight line, but in an arc, circling from east to west, vanishing below the horizon, only to rise again. They charted these paths with quills and patience, recording in quiet Latin what they had seen. Sphera Mundi, they called it, the sphere of the world. The phrase appeared again and again in manuscripts that smelled of ink and wax, each copy a whisper from one generation to the next. To live in that world was to live with a sense of motion. The earth did not stand still. It turned beneath the heavens, slow enough to be unnoticed, steady enough to be trusted. The people who ploughed the fields felt this in the seasons, the tilt of sunlight, the long curve of shadows shifting from one month to the next. Their calendars were circles, not lines. Time, like the earth, returned upon itself. In the stillness of night, far from towns and lamps, a traveller could stand on a hill and feel the curve beneath him. The horizon wrapped around in every direction, soft and continuous. Above him, the stars arched across the sky like the ribs of a great dome. The wind moved evenly over the grass. There was no beginning, no edge, only return. The same stars rising and setting, the same earth turning beneath them. This was not knowledge written in books, but in the senses. It did not need to be proven, it only needed to be remembered. Centuries later, when the story of a flat Earth Middle Ages took shape, it was not out of malice, but misunderstanding. Writers of the 19th century, eager to celebrate science, needed contrast, a dark background against which progress could shine. They imagined the past as fearful and small-minded, unable to see the truth that to them seemed obvious. But the truth had always been known. The earth had always curved, the stars had always told the same story. The only difference was the listener. To medieval eyes, the curve of the earth was not merely physical, it was spiritual. It suggested completeness, the joining of beginning and end, the promise that all paths eventually return home. The roundness of the world mirrored the roundness of the soul's journey, the cycle of birth, toil, rest, and renewal. To walk across the land was to move along the surface of something vast and whole, something without edge or end. Even the maps of that time, though strange to modern eyes, carry this sense of wholeness. The Mappa Mundi of Hereford, drawn on vellum and faded by centuries, does not flatten the earth. It bends it inward, encircling it with seas and clouds. Jerusalem sits at its center, not as a claim of geography, but of meaning. Around it wind rivers, mountains, and beasts, all enclosed in a perfect circle, the shape of understanding. It is the mind of the age drawn in ink, not a chart of distance, but a meditation on connection. If you hold such a map today, you can feel the calm of its lines. The world it shows is smaller, yes, but also more intimate. Every place touches every other. The oceans are not barriers, but loops. The edges, not ends, but beginnings again. The people who made these maps did not fear falling off the world. They feared forgetting that they were part of it. Now, as night settles again, imagine standing by the sea. The tide moves softly at your feet. The air smells of salt and memory. Far out, a ship slides toward the horizon. You watch as it fades, not all at once, but gradually, piece by piece, hull, mast, sail, until only the idea of it remains. You know, as those before you knew, that it is not gone. It is only hidden by the curve of the earth. The stars rise above the water, slow and unhurried. They follow their old circular path, the same path traced by hands long vanished. The wind hums low. The sea breathes, the world turns. In that motion lies the quiet truth that has never changed, that the earth beneath you is whole, patient, and endless in its return. And so the myth of the flat world fades back into silence, replaced by what was always there, the gentle certainty of a sphere turning beneath the sky, steady as breath, eternal as sleep. The quiet weight of judgment. Before courts, before written codes and careful trials, justice was a matter of faith. In small villages where stories traveled faster than truth, people turned to the only certainty they knew, the unseen balance of the world itself. When a wrong was done and words could not decide, they called upon ordeal. It was both ritual and judgment, both punishment and prayer. To endure the test was to place one's life into the hands of whatever governed fate. The accused might stand before the community in the morning light, the air still cool, the faces around them silent. The priest or elder would speak a few words, steady and formal, asking not for vengeance, but for clarity. A fire would already be burning nearby, its coals white and calm. From that fire, an iron bar was drawn, glowing red at its center. The accused reached for it with bare hands, holding it only for a breath, long enough for the heat to mark skin and soul alike. The crowd watched, not with cruelty, but with solemn quiet. The iron was returned to its place. The wound was wrapped in linen and sealed. In 3 days it would be opened. If the flesh had begun to heal, innocence was declared. If it had blackened or festered, guilt. The logic seems impossible now, but within its simplicity lay a strange kind of peace. To the people of that time, fate was not abstract. It was present in the air, in the water, in the whisper of wind between the trees. The ordeal was not an act of torture, it was a conversation with the divine. The outcome was not random, it was revelation. Justice belonged not to men but to something greater, something that moved unseen but was believed to be fair. Other trials followed similar rhythms. In some places, the accused would plunge a hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. The water would be blessed, the act witnessed by many. The heat itself was thought to reveal the truth. Just as gold is tested by fire, so too, they said, is the purity of the soul. To withstand the pain was to prove alignment with what was right. The test was harsh, yet it offered something rare, the possibility of certainty. In colder regions, the ordeal of water reversed the logic. The accused, bound by rope, was cast into a river or pond. Water, symbol of purity, was believed to reject what was impure. If the body sank, it meant acceptance and innocence. If it floated, guilt was assumed. The simplicity of the act was both terrible and reassuring. The judgment was not in human hands. It belonged to the elements. To modern minds, such rituals feel cruel, yet within their design lay intention rather than malice. These were communities without written law, without juries, without forensics. What they possessed instead was a deep trust that the natural world reflected moral truth. To them, water could not lie, fire could not deceive. The body, as vessel of the soul, revealed through its endurance what words could not. Many priests understood the danger of such faith. They saw the suffering it caused and tried, quietly, to soften it. Records tell of clergymen who cooled the water before the test, who loosened the knots, who declared a wound healed when it was only beginning to close. Their aim was not to defy the ritual, but to preserve mercy within it. They sought balance, to keep order without feeding cruelty. For even then, people understood that truth was not always found in pain. Sometimes it was hidden in compassion. The ordeal carried not just judgment but symbolism. To face fire was to face purity. To face water was to face cleansing. To survive was to be reborn. These ideas echoed the seasons, the cycles of death and renewal that ruled the medieval imagination. Each test mirrored the endless tension between fear and hope. Those who endured were not only acquitted, they were transformed, lifted for a moment above the uncertainty of the world. When the wounds healed, when the river calmed, life returned to its rhythm. The villagers went back to their fields. The iron cooled. The same fire that had judged now warmed bread and boiled water. The same river that had condemned now carried reflections of clouds and leaves. Justice, like everything else, folded back into the pattern of daily life. As centuries passed, the ordeals began to fade. Reason slowly replaced ritual. Written law spread through kingdoms and towns. Witnesses were called, oaths sworn, words weighed against words. The church itself began to question the wisdom of asking God to intervene in such small, human disputes. In 1215, a council in Rome declared that priests should no longer bless the water or the iron, and without blessing, the ordeal lost its power. People turned instead to argument, evidence, persuasion. Fragile tools, yet more merciful than flame and river. Still, the memory of the ordeal did not vanish. It lingered in language, in stories, in the quiet corners of human thought. We still speak of trials by fire, of baptism by water, of being tested by fate. These phrases carry the echo of an older world, a world that believed pain could purify and that truth, no matter how hidden, would eventually rise to the surface. If you listen closely, you can almost feel the weight of those old mornings. The smell of smoke, the hush of a gathered crowd, the stillness of breath before the moment begins. The accused steps forward, the iron glows, time holds itself still. Then a brief contact, heat, light, pain, and it is done. The rest is waiting for the bandage to open, for the skin to speak, waiting for the world to decide. In that waiting lies the essence of the ordeal, not the act itself, but the silence after it. The hours between judgment and revelation, where uncertainty becomes prayer. For those who lived then, that silence was not emptiness. It was filled with presence, with the belief that the universe was listening. Now the centuries have quieted, the fires have gone out, the rivers flow undisturbed, yet the longing that once created the ordeal remains. The desire to know, to be certain, to feel that justice moves somewhere beyond our reach. Even today, when we speak of fairness, we invoke that same quiet hope that truth exists, that it will rise in time, that the unseen still carries weight. The ordeal was not only a relic of faith, it was an act of surrender. It asked people to let go of control, to place their fate into the hands of what they could not see. In that surrender, there was fear, but also peace. For once the test began, there was nothing more to decide. The world would answer, the wound would speak, the judgment would come, not in words, but in the quiet breath between pain and healing. And as night falls now over the memory of those ancient fields, the fires burn low again. The water reflects the stars. The iron lies cold. What remains is the echo, the soft hum of a world that once believed truth could be touched, and that somewhere in the stillness between suffering and mercy, justice itself was listening. Legends beneath the cloak. The forests of England were once deep and endless, a sea of green stretching beyond the reach of kings. The air there was cool and wet, carrying the scent of pine and moss. Light fell through the canopy in soft threads, touching the ground in trembling circles. Within that quiet wilderness, stories began to take root. Stories of a man who lived outside the law but carried justice in his heart. His name was Robin Hood, though no single man ever owned it. It was a name born of wind and memory, passed from one voice to another until it belonged to everyone. The earliest songs about him were simple ballads, sung by travellers and minstrels in smoky halls. They told of a bowman who robbed the rich to feed the poor, who moved like a shadow through the trees, who laughed at the law and yet upheld something deeper. He was not a hero of conquest or crown, he was a hero of balance. In a world of hunger and hierarchy, he stood for the common man, not through speeches or glory, but through small acts of fairness whispered across the greenwood. No one knew where he began. Some said he was a nobleman wronged by power, others that he was a yeoman who turned against corruption. A few believed he was only an idea, the dream of justice imagined by those who had none. In truth, he was likely all these things at once. Across centuries, the songs gathered fragments of many lives, fugitives who fled the sheriff's men, soldiers returning from war to find their lands gone, wanderers who refused to bow. Together they became one shape, cloaked in green and memory. In those tales, the forest was more than a setting. It was a refuge, a world beyond walls and rules. Among the trees, the outlaw found freedom, not from morality, but from corruption. The leaves shielded him from tyranny, the streams reflected a simpler truth. Around him gathered others, Little John, Friar Tuck, Will Scarlet, names that carried warmth and loyalty, companions in rebellion. Together they formed a small world apart, an echo of what justice might look like when unbound from the heavy weight of kings. As the stories spread, the outlaw's shape changed. The centuries added polish and sorrow. He became less a thief and more a knight of the woods, a man who fought not just for bread, but for principle. In some tales he served King Richard, in others he opposed all crowns alike. The ballads bent to the needs of each age. To peasants, he was hope. To poets, he was romance. To rulers, he was warning. The man beneath the hood was never fixed. He was made of whatever the world needed him to be. There is something timeless in that. The way a story grows beyond its origin. How a name becomes a mirror. When people sang of Robin Hood, they were not simply remembering him. They were remembering themselves, their hunger for fairness, their quiet defiance. The outlaw's bow pointed not at enemies, but at injustice itself, invisible and everywhere. His arrows flew through centuries, landing softly in the imagination of those who longed for balance. Elsewhere, across the fields of story, another figure rode, the Black Knight. His image was colder, his legend less forgiving. Clad in dark armor that swallowed light, he appeared in the songs of Arthurian courts and the chronicles of noble wars. Where Robin Hood lived in the open air, the Black Knight rode through shadow. His presence was a question rather than an answer. Who did he serve? What did he hide? And why did he choose darkness as his color? In truth, there were many such knights, men who bore black crests on their shields, not for evil, but for distinction. Black armor absorbed the light of the battlefield, hiding heraldry, making identity uncertain. To wear it was to renounce display, to let actions speak instead of lineage. Yet, as stories grew, the meaning shifted. The color of shadow became the color of mystery. The knight without a banner became a symbol of solitude, a man loyal to no one, caught between duty and doubt. Poets and playwrights later filled his silence with feeling. He became the wanderer who fought for forgotten causes, the avenger who carried regret like a shield. His darkness was not cruelty but melancholy, a reflection of the world's own greyness. Where Robin Hood laughed beneath leaves, the Black Knight rode through fog. Both were bound by conscience, yet separated by tone. One the bright defiance of daylight, the other the quiet endurance of night. Over time, the two figures came to stand as opposites that completed each other. The outlaw and the knight, one outside the law, one bound by it. One ruled by freedom, the other by duty. Yet both were born of the same need, to believe that honor could survive in a world built on power. They were not enemies. They were reflections, each holding a fragment of the same truth, that justice, in its purest form, often lives beyond the reach of law. The ballads that carried their names drifted through generations. They were sung in fields, written in plays, printed in books. Their edges softened, their meanings blurred. Yet the core remained. Courage without arrogance, rebellion without hate, faith in a balance that the world rarely gives. Each listener reshaped the story, finding within it what they lacked: hope, bravery, forgiveness. The legend endured because it never asked to be precise, it only asked to be felt. Now the forests that once hid outlaws have grown smaller, and the castles that once held knights have turned to stone and silence, yet their shadows linger. In every tale of resistance, in every story of a quiet hero who stands alone, there is a trace of greenwood and iron. The hood and the helm remain, symbols of the same human wish to act rightly when the world turns unjust. As night settles over the old hills of England, the wind moves softly through the trees. The leaves murmur like distant voices, the same ones that once told of arrows in flight and swords drawn for forgotten causes. The air carries their memory, not of men, but of ideals. Somewhere between the laughter of the outlaw and the silence of the night lies the balance they both sought. The forest darkens. The stars rise above its edge. The stories rest, folded into the quiet hum of time. Robin Hood and the Black Knight fade once more into the cloak of myth, where names dissolve and only meaning remains. A soft reminder that courage need not shout, that rebellion can live in quiet hearts, and that even in the stillest hour, the world remembers those who dared to stand unseen beneath the trees. The hidden places of stone and fire. In the wetlands of eastern England, where mist drifts low over reeds and water murmurs beneath the soil, men once built an abbey upon the mud. The place was called Crowland. To reach it, travellers crossed wooden bridges that creaked with every step, the sound mixing with the cries of birds and the slow breath of the fen. The monks who settled there came not for comfort, but for solitude. They drove oak piles deep into the shifting ground, layer after layer, until the earth stopped trembling. Over them they laid gravel, then stone, then prayer. The work took years. The swamp resisted, swallowing foundations, erasing walls, yet the monks began again. In the patience of their labor, there was faith. Not the kind written in words, but the kind lived through endurance. When the abbey finally stood, its reflection lay upon the water like another world. By day, smoke from their fires rose in thin white threads. By night, the sound of chanting drifted through the fog, soft as breath. They built gardens upon floating soil, tended herbs that cured fever, copied books by candlelight. Rain washed against their walls, wind carried the smell of peat and salt, but the abbey endured. Even now its ruins stand quiet among the marshes, proof that persistence can turn fragility into stone. Far from the fens, another story took root, one not of stone, but of rumour. It told of a woman who once ruled the church, disguised as a man. They called her Pope Joan. Some said she was a scholar from Mainz, others that she was a traveller who reached Rome by chance and rose through wisdom alone. The tales said she disguised herself, her mind sharper than any who doubted her, her voice steady in debate. In time, she was chosen to lead, her secret hidden beneath robes of white. Only when she bore a child during a procession was the truth revealed, and the crowd turned from awe to fury. That, the legend said, was how her reign ended. Abruptly erased from records, her name left to drift between disbelief and memory. No historian has proved she lived, no chronicler of her time mentions her. Yet her story persists, passed through centuries not as fact, but as whisper. Perhaps she never existed, perhaps she existed in more ways than one. Legends like hers survive because they speak to something deeper than proof, to the tension between truth and silence, between identity and the masks time demands. Whether imagined or real, she became a symbol of how history often conceals the very voices it fears to acknowledge. On parchment, she remains a faint shadow in the margin, an unanswered question that continues to breathe. And beyond both the abbey and the rumour, there were men who lived by vow and discipline, the Knights Templar. They were born from chaos, soldiers sworn to protect pilgrims travelling through a land of dust and heat. Their armour was plain, their cloaks white, each marked with a red cross that caught the sun like fire. They spoke little, rose before dawn, prayed before battle. Their vows were simple: poverty, chastity, obedience. They owned nothing but their loyalty. Their days began in silence and ended in silence, measured by the ringing of bells and the whisper of steel upon wet stone. In their halls, built from cold stone, light fell through narrow windows and touched the floor like water. Meals were taken without speech: bread, broth, a cup of wine, enough to live, never enough to linger. At night, they slept in armor, ready to rise if called. Each action was a gesture of restraint. To the world, they were warriors. To themselves, they were servants. Their strength came not from conquest, but from order. A fire kept beneath discipline, burning quietly but without end. As years passed, their power grew, and with power came suspicion. Kings who had once sought their aid began to fear their wealth and secrecy. Rumors spread of hidden rituals, of treasures buried beneath their fortresses, of knowledge too ancient to name. In 1307, on a cold October morning, they were seized, accused of heresy, their order dissolved by decree. Some confessed under pain, others remained silent. Their last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake. It is said that as the fire rose, he called upon heaven to judge those who condemned him. Within the year, both Pope and King were dead. History, indifferent yet poetic, closed the circle. But beneath the ashes, the idea remained: that discipline could outlast destruction, that loyalty could survive betrayal. The Templars became myth, their red cross a symbol of endurance. Some said they fled east, some that they built new orders in secret. The truth is quieter. Most simply vanished into the world they had once guarded, carrying nothing but memory. Their stones crumbled, their fires went out. Yet the calm strength of their rule, silence, precision, unity, would echo in monasteries, guilds, even armies, for centuries after. 3 stories, distant yet bound: the abbey in the marsh, the woman hidden behind her name, the brotherhood of stone and vow. Each speaks of endurance, of what it means to stand firm against time. The monks built upon water and made it hold. The legend of Pope Joan built upon silence and made it speak. The Templars built upon obedience and made it eternal. All found strength in isolation, in the spaces the world overlooks. If you walk today through the ruins of Crowland, you can still feel the weight of that patience. The air smells of damp earth and age. Birds nest in the arches where bells once hung. Stones gleam with moss and rain. The abbey does not rise in pride, but in persistence. The quiet defiance of something that refuses to vanish. And somewhere, in libraries and half-forgotten songs, the other legends rest beside it, layered like pages of the same long story. Night falls slowly over these places. The fen darkens, the water glows faintly with reflected light. In some unseen archive, a scribe closes his book. In the far distance, a single candle flickers within a ruined hall. Fire, stone, and silence, the 3 elements of endurance. The world holds its breath, and for a moment, the past feels near again, patient as the marsh, unbroken as the vow, and as steady as the slow turning of the earth. The sleep of civilizations. As the centuries moved forward, the world changed its shape, yet carried the same desires. Cities rose and fell, their walls turned to dust, but the pattern of living remained. Work, hunger, longing, belief. Beneath each age lay the same heartbeat, steady and patient. In Pompeii, the brothel called the Lupanar became a small reflection of that rhythm. Within its narrow rooms, the walls still whisper, Paintings in red and ochre show scenes of commerce and desire, not as scandal but as part of the city's breath. Prices were carved above doorways, names were scratched into plaster, moments of pride, boredom, affection. Each mark is a trace of life too ordinary to be preserved, yet the ash made it eternal. When Vesuvius buried the town in its sudden sleep, it sealed not only buildings but gestures, the curve of a hand, a laugh half-finished, a footprint in dust. 2,000 years later, those gestures remain, fragile and human, reminders that even in the heart of empire, people lived not in grandeur, but in small, repeating rituals of need and connection. Far to the east, in the hard valleys of Sparta, life followed another rhythm, one of restraint. Here, affection was measured not in softness, but in strength. Brides cut their hair, their beauty hidden beneath simplicity. Husbands visited them in secrecy, slipping from barracks under moonlight and returning before dawn. The city's love was not tender, it was utilitarian, bound to survival. Children were shaped by endurance, raised to stand without tears, to see pain as practice. The state was the parent, the family a vessel. Within that discipline lay both power and loss, a society built to last, yet stripped of gentleness. Now the centuries are quiet again. The volcano is cold, the training fields are empty, the noise of ambition has drifted away like dust over forgotten stones. The warriors sleep, the dancers rest, the trials have ended. What remains are the traces, names on walls, bones beneath earth, and the faint memory of movement through air. The world turns on, patient as ever, carrying the silence of all it has seen. Above the ruins the night spreads wide, the stars hang steady, unmoved by time. The earth, round and silent, turns once more beneath them. Wind passes softly through columns and grass. No one speaks, yet everything listens. Somewhere between breath and dream, history continues its quiet pulse, the same pulse that has always guided it, from the first firelight to this very hour. The world rests, but it does not end. It only sleeps waiting for dawn. Closing reflection, the long breath of time. The journey ends as it began, in quiet. The voices that once filled the air have softened into whispers, their echoes fading into the rhythm of night. No judgment remains, no fear, only the gentle pulse of memory moving through the dark. Across every age, people searched for meaning, in stone, in song, in the simple act of enduring. They built, they believed, they rested, and the earth kept turning beneath them. The past does not vanish, it becomes air, folded into the breath of the present. Now, as the world settles and your thoughts drift towards stillness, let the weight of centuries grow light. Let time itself exhale. The world sleeps, calm and unbroken, and within that sleep, history breathes, slow, steady, endless, like the tide returning to shore.